Tim. Hey Tim, how are you today? I was looking over the show flow today and I'm a little conflicted. See what I did there?
Yeah, I understand. There's a lot to talk about, and I don't even know where to start with this topic. But let's dive in real quickly and see what we can. We're going to be talking about conflict. And conflict is one of those things, if you're going to have human beings, you're going to be working with in and around conflict. We don't like it, but it's a part of human nature, right?
It is, absolutely. Do you have a personal example?
That's what I was going to talk about. So it was more of an aha moment. Um, I had been teaching project management for probably about 3 or 4 years. And I was brushing up on IT project management topics, and there's this wonderful software development book. I don't even think it's in print anymore. And the guy had one whole chapter on something called Don't Flip the Bozo Bit. The bozo bit, first of all, a bit in technology is a container of information. It's either a 1 or a 0. And so when you flip it, you go from an off to an on, a 0 to 1, or 1 to a 0, right? And he was saying, don't turn people into bozos from your perception. And I was thinking about that real hard, and I was thinking, what about conflict? What about argument? Doesn't that make people hard to work with? And all of a sudden I said, no, that's another bozo bit that I've been living with all my life. And I figured out at that moment, and I tried it. By the way, anything I come up with, any of my ideas, number one, I test on myself and I evaluate and see what the results are. And then I give it to my students to test on too. And so these are not just, good ideas. These are actually testable, valid results that I've been observing. And when I look at conflict, I found out that number one, conflict is not about the argument or the issue. And we'll talk about arguments later. Conflict is actually about the emotional attachment to one side of the argument where you're not willing to budge. It's saying this idea I have is of great value. Now, that's wonderful. That gives us persistence. But the problem is it doesn't allow us to let go of something to go further. Now, I saw this in my own life, right? Today, we're moving about half of our library down from my office here, and we're moving it up to our study up on the up in the loft. And my wife is saying, "How are we going to organize these books?" And I tell her, "Oh, use the Dewey Decimal System." And she says to me, "Oh, I know you. You always say that, but I want to organize them, Tim. I want to have the science books here, the poetry books here, and the math books here." And I'm thinking to myself, well, you know, I could continue this conversation and it would be probably useless for me. And that's what conflict is. It's holding on to my perception that I am right and somebody else is wrong. It's my opinion is better than anybody else's. And the moment I embraced this, all of a sudden everything was easy. Allow other people to change their perceptions. I can change my perceptions based on the person around me because they're just that. They're perceptions and opinions. They're imaginary. They're not what truth is. And if I realize that, it opens me up to continue to grow and pursue truth itself instead of hold myself back. That was a major turning point in my path towards leadership.
No, and that makes a lot of sense. Today I think what I'd like to do is discuss the whole idea of conflict whether or not it has an upside. We certainly know it has a downside. But what I thought I would do as we get this started, and I loved your story, especially something as, what could be deemed trivial as organizing your books and the situation between you and your wife. Yet that is typically something that can generate into a prolonged conflict on projects.
Oh,
So what,
yeah.
and so what I thought I would do is just kind of talk a little bit. Maybe you can add to this as well in terms of what is conflict, and from some of my own experiences, I know, first of all, the easy part is, well, it's a disagreement, it's an argument, it's a dispute, it's sometimes it manifests itself in insults and passive aggressiveness and bullying, even perhaps anger. Typically, from my observation, we have spats on projects, but typically conflict is something that is protracted. And it's often caused by, say, a misunderstood communication. It could be caused by personality clashes. Let's face it, not everybody is lovable to you and me, and we are not lovable to everyone else, right? There may be some incompatibilities. A lot of conflict that I have seen, and this is the unfortunate part, and it's true, it's germane to what we discuss as project managers. It can result from organizational mismanagement, and projects can be I think you've used the term Petri dishes before. Projects can be that Petri dish in organizational mismanagement. And what I've also seen is that people will perceive conflict. You used the term just now, perception, which I really like, but they will perceive conflict when they perceive inequities, and they perceive or they have unmet needs, and they have unclear roles. And I think this is where, as we discuss this today, we as project managers really need to understand that we are not bystanders. If someone has an unmet need, we need to be there to understand our team and realize that there is an unmet need.
Yeah, and you said that last week, and we can say it again. It's we. This is not an us versus them thing. It's a we thing, and I agree wholeheartedly with that. Now, let me add a little bit more to the mix, and then we can go into our definitions.
Sure.
So when I am conflicted, or when I have a conflict, I have an emotional attachment that disallows me from letting go of what I think. Now, this has all to do with ethics, okay? Because all of a sudden I've emplaced my value system on something outside of who I am. This is my idea, and to attack my idea is to attack me. And that is the source of all conflict. We have ideas, and it's us. And so when we debate or we argue, and we'll get into what those means, it's an emotional attack. And that's what actually, when protracted, can create devastation on any type of group. We're not just talking about projects.
Yeah. Well, and that makes sense. And I think I've used this example before, but I have a good friend in the vendor community. He and I have worked projects together, and he and I have worked projects where I have been in an oversight capacity over his projects. And he and I have had some pretty down and out Donnybrooks on the project behind closed doors. And 3 hours later, we're drinking a beer together. So I think there are ways, I think what you had mentioned before, I think there are ways that we can have conflict. We can kind of resolve things. And part of it comes down to, we as project managers tend to be very strong individuals. And so sometimes we perhaps do hold on to ideas too tightly. And then when someone tries to contradict those ideas, we dig in, and that's where some of the conflict comes. So I think your example was exactly right. And it just reminded me of that situation.
So let's go through a laundry list of definitions here. Now, we may use these differently.
Yeah.
But I'll give you the traditional ones, and we'll see which ones we want to play with. And we're going to primarily focus on conflict today. But when you look at communications, okay, and communications is exchange of information, two-way, whether it's intentional or unintentional, okay? And historically, we've called that discourse. Discourse is, here's some information to you, and you send me some information back. Then we have debate. Debate says, I have an idea here. What's your idea? Let's get together and compare. And it's playing within a certain set of rules, and we'll talk about those rules later. But basically, it's the ability to argue in a set of rules, and they're very formal rules. Now, argument itself is where we get into the, I have my side, you have your side. And that's where us versus them is established. Now, we sometimes call debate argument and debate, and they're totally two different things. Argument does not have a predefined set of rules, where debate does. Now, before we get to conflict, let's talk about two other things. Persuasion. It's the attempt to get somebody else to see things from your perspective. And we can go as deep as you want to into this, how to do it, what are the tools, why should you do it, what are the ethics. There's a bright side to persuasion, and there's a dark side of persuasion. Persuasion from a happy standpoint is called persuasion. But when you use the same identical tools in an unethical way, we call that manipulation. And again, you know, we live with this. We don't know this, but since the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 1930s, our culture has been so socially inundated by communications and messaging that persuasion and influence and even manipulation has been built into how businesses attempt to get us to consume what they make. We live in the middle of it. And luckily, I've been watching my children grow up in school over the last 25 years. And schools have done a pretty good job in my area to help educate kids in this. So, conflict.
Yeah.
No rules. And it's the establishment of that emotional attachment, and you have huge amount of like you said, protracted argument. It's not going to be an argument you get over. So go ahead.
No,
go ahead.
What I was thinking too, I'd read some excerpts from a book called Conflict Without Casualties. The author is Nate Regier, I think is how you pronounce his last name, Regier. But here's a definition. I want you to think about this too. Maybe we can weave it into our discussion today. He said, conflict is simply the energy created by the gap between what we want and what we're experiencing. And I think that kind of goes along with what you had also talked about before. It's kind of like, I'm so tied to my idea that if someone else challenges that idea, that I'm suddenly in conflict with that person.
So yes, you're exactly right, and the author is exactly right. Because when we talk about influence, influence is the ability to change things outside of us. In order to do this well, you need power, okay? And power usually has to do with authority. That's one form of power. The Greeks, particularly Aristotle, said there's three powers that we use in argument and debate, and persuasion and manipulation, okay? Ethics, this is wrong, this is right. Emotion, what I feel. Mm-hmm. And this is where conflict comes in. This is the primary power that is behind emotion, behind conflict. And then we have logic. We call this phronesis, which is practical wisdom. This is where I sit down and say, see, it makes sense. Here, doesn't it? Can't you follow my logic? And they call it arete, which is moral character. This is wrong, this is right, right? Hammer breaking a window is wrong. A hammer hammering nails into wood is right. And we use that. in actually trying to debate and persuade. And then we have our eumonia, which is the goodwill, or the ethical part, or the emotional. It's the emotional part, not the ethical part. Excuse me. And it's the sense that we want to be conceiving of each other as part of the great we. And in the conflict, there's no attempt to actually manage that we, but it's the job of us to step in and to get that conflict under control.
Well, and what I appreciate those definitions, and they are great definitions, but what I also know is that having experience on projects and having seen conflict on projects, often the emotional and the logical do not coincide. Because if you approach something from, say, a conflict resolution from a logical perspective, sometimes you don't get very far because the person or persons in the conflict, or perhaps yourself as being the conflictor, you might be so emotionally tied to it that you don't see the logic, and vice
Right.
versa. So I think we as project managers, well, I know we as project managers have to turn our EQ antenna on high in order to be able to deal with conflict in the workplace, and to be able to deal with our staff in a way that they want to be dealt with.
I think of my students, and they get so frustrated with this material that I'm putting them through. And I'm always telling them, slow down, take a breath, think it through. And it's funny. I remember the gray-haired project managers I worked around were the same way. And I'm wondering if this is not something that you don't focus on early, but you focus on later.
Well, that's a good question, because I think, if you're in part of a project, you're so immersed, especially at the beginning of a project, you're so immersed in getting everything correct. You want that Gantt chart right. You want your deliverable definitions right. You want everyone in their roles working, so that sometimes you forget about the other areas, especially um, the non-IT areas of what it is that we do, such as alerting people to the fact that there will be conflicts, and getting those things out of the way.
And you know what? This is so antithetical. In fact, Project Management Institute, in their project management training, have reorganized the preferred training method in project management. And it says you got to get your people stuff straight before you get the technical stuff done.
Yeah.
You got to get the people thing first. You got to get leadership. You got to get the team charter. That is the highest priority work. They're communicating this over and over and over and over. And it's funny because I'm the same way as you. Let's get this schedule so we can get it out of the way and we can work on the soft skills.
Yeah.
And then everything will be all right. And I'm wondering if we're doing things the wrong way.
Well, and particularly for newer project managers who want to truly show their worth to their management and to the people that have hired them, they want to get everything right technically. They want to get that project humming on all cylinders, right? You want to be moving forward, and the way you move forward is you show the tasks being uh, completed on the schedule. So
Yeah.
that's where you're going to put your energies. And you're right, the soft skills, what we call, I think you and I, well, I know we did a show a little while ago on emotional intelligence. Some of that we sort of put to the side while we get all of the technical things out of the way first. And that's probably a huge mistake if we don't get grounded initially on the project to get everyone on the same pace moving forward.
Right. And you're halfway into the project and you're pushing aside the emotional and the social needs of your team. How are you going to restore trust? Even if you have a perfectly running project, you have a sports car here, but who's going to help you maintain it?
Well, and sports car is a great analogy, because the teams that I have had the privilege of leading and being part of are absolutely some of the brightest and best individuals in the industry. I mean, these people they can run projects in their sleep. And so it is that we rely on that technical prowess so much that we forget to deal with the human parts, the people aspects of what it is that we're doing.
So you and I agree that conflict management is one of those management skills that we have to establish early and invest in. Maybe not higher than these technical, but it has to be on the table from day one.
It has to be part of, I think, when I wrote a blog post, I remember this is quite some time ago now, where, even as project, let's say I'm a project manager starting off a project, I gather my 2 or 3 team leads or whatever I've got, and we spend a couple of weeks putting together the finest project schedule you've ever seen. In the meantime, our staff, we've got them working on tasks that perhaps can get them going. But why haven't we involved them in what we're doing? They're the ones on the ground. They're the ones that have the most recent experience in running certain tasks. Why don't we get them involved in developing the project schedule? Number one, we get the benefit of their experience, which is more recent than ours, being on the ground. And secondly, we get them involved immediately, and we begin to show them their worth to the project and begin to build that self-esteem in them.
Yeah, and thirdly, on top of that, Merv, we get their commitment.
Yes.
They're bound to support it if they see that's my schedule. I voted for it. I participated in it. So you have that inbuilt responsibility and accountability and commitment. This is the beautiful thing of doing that. Now, when you delegate these things and you learn how to do that, that takes some things off your desk and it opens you up to actually start playing with these more advanced theories in human behavior and organizational development and team development.
Well, and those younger, and I'm saying younger because typically that's the situation, and those younger people who have suddenly been tasked with something that is out of their normal day-to-day work, they grab it and they run with it, and they're learning a new skill. They may not perfect it the first or second time, but they're learning a new skill for when they at some point become project leads and project managers themselves. So it's a huge way of setting up an environment that sets up those relationships that help avoid the petty conflicts later on when people feel like they're not being treated correctly or being valued as valuable resources on the project.
I watched one of my mentors back in early 2001, 2002, and he was brilliant on this. He and I talked about how he came about doing it. And he said, look at the Tuckman ladder, Tim.
Yeah.
And he said, you form, you storm, you norm, and you perform, right? Everybody storms. There's a point like about 6, 7 weeks into a project where everybody starts letting their guard down and they start behaving natural, and people start saying things like, I don't like it when you put your coffee cup close to my paper. I don't like your messy desk, Tim. Can you organize it like I do? Now, number one, you could say, okay, here it goes. I have to get to work. Or you can say, this is a teachable moment, because we're going to get into critical debates and we cannot have conflict later on. So if I can find these moments to teach these people a very good, easy way to manage conflict so that when they get into those arguments, they automatically fall into the good behaviors. This is wonderful. And he said, everything that you can do early in a project that may not have great impact may be an opportunity to train and build people and make it really easy for when you get into the rough parts later on.
Yeah. So let's do this, Tim. I was thinking we spent some time on defining conflict, and it's truly project-related conflict, but it does apply to the workplace in general or other sorts of relationships. What I'd like to do is at some point get to the point of dealing with perhaps the upsides of healthy conflict. But before we do that, we've been kind of assuming or allowing our audience to assume that everyone knows the kinds of conflict, the kinds of things that can happen on projects that bring the downside. So maybe let's spend a few minutes on talking about the downside of conflict on projects or in the workplace in general, and then build from there in terms of how it is that we can show upsides and how it is that we can approach conflict on our projects. Does that make sense?
Great, great. You want to start or you want me to start?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah,
Okay,
let's talk about some of the
so
downsides.
let's start with an issue.
Sure.
An issue says, an issue says, I'm here. I'm not a risk. I might not happen. I've already happened, or I'm here, and I'm going to impact your work. And as a project manager, you say, we got to resolve this issue, right? Okay, that's an issue. Now, conflict is the emotional attachment to two sides. It could be the issue itself. It could be the perception of issues. Now, this is how complicated it can get. Let's suppose we have 5 laborers and we only have 3 shovels. How are they going to resolve this? It's an issue. It's not conflict. One person thinks to themselves, oh, somebody's going to give up their right to a shovel because they're lazy. Another one says, I want to get this work done early, so I work faster than everybody else. And all of a sudden, you don't have just one conflict here. You have a mess. And on top of that, you still have the issue to be resolved. And as human beings, we have to manage through these conflicts and get these conflicts managed before we even get to the issues. And this is the struggle we have.
Well, that's true. So that example that you just used, is a great example of work disruption, where a conflict, an issue can become a conflict, which then causes work disruption, which what does that do to our project schedules? The other thing that I've noticed very much so is when I've noticed, and again, I'm dealing with the term conflict in terms of the protracted, not just one-off scuffles, but a true protracted conflict that's been going on for some time or will go on for the future if it's not nipped in the bud. And that is that you can actually see, you can watch decreased productivity. You can see it in your schedule. Tasks that used to be completed on time are now taking longer. People are not speaking to each other in the mornings. People are avoiding each other in the hallways. People are snapping at each other in meetings. And you can see that decreased productivity begins to get stronger and stronger and stronger on the project team.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And again, on these major projects, understanding the perceptions and needs of the stakeholders, stakeholder identification. If you don't really understand what their perceptions are, this can be not just disruptive to the project, it can be fatal. Data centers, data centers. I bought this nice little network server, right? It's down by my feet. That's where all my critical data is. And corporate headquarters says, no, that's not safe. We need to wrap it under a big building and it's going to be 2 states away. Now, how am I going to convince 7,000 admins in a corporation that it's safer 2 states away than as a little box by my feet?
Right.
This is one of the jobs that you have to do. And this is months of effort in marketing, in communication, in surveys, in analysis, and in engagement. This is where we can actually win the day, or we can allow the whole initiative to fail.
Well, and you brought up the term stakeholder, and it just reminded me, in my younger days, when I was first starting off as a project manager, again, I'm going to go back to the fact that my job in my mind was to impress my management. I wanted to get that next promotion. I wanted to get that next raise. So I needed to impress my management by my ability to bring the project in on time and on budget. But I had this pesky, I'll call it a thing, called my client. So my whole project team was humming. They knew what they were doing. We were experienced project delivery people, but we had this client that we had to satisfy who kept getting in the way. And it seemed like, if I can go back to that year definition, there was that gap between what I wanted and what I was experiencing. And I was forgetting that the conflict I was creating was that I needed to get the work done, but it was my client who needed to understand what I was doing so that they could insert their subject matter expertise into what I was doing.
Now, this is where leadership is really critical.
Yes.
You need to lead yourself, because what you said was perception. You are not wrong. You are not wrong. You've spotted an issue and you need to resolve it. Okay? That's not wrong. That's good behavior. The perception is what needs to be corrected. And luckily, perceptions are a lot easier to correct than behavior, which is a lot easier to correct than people. If you're talking about correcting people, and you're right, for the first 3 years of our careers, if it wasn't for people, these project things would be really easy. And then about year 5, you say, that's all that a project is. The mechanics, the technical stuff, I can delegate that all the day long. That's just mechanical, and you can teach people that. But leadership, you have to grow into.
Well, and what you said is exactly correct. I was not wrong in my idea to get the project done to bring the project in on time within budget. But neither was the client wrong in wanting to understand what I was doing so that they could keep up with me. And so it's that different expectations from each other that was causing the conflict, which didn't even have to be. And as I matured in my project management abilities, I understood that I had to bring my client along with me. And sometimes that took a little longer for the very specific idea that I had to get across to them, or that I had to sit and wait and learn from them. But as I took those moments, that time to understand them and them to understand me, it's interestingly how the project progressed even quicker.
Yes. Now, what you were talking about there is framing. Changing of perceptions or changing of context is actually one of the active tools that you can use in managing conflict. Okay, it's giving extra details or extra history or extra background and saying, see, this is not the whole story we're dealing with. We have a lot of other things we need to consider. Now, I'm not saying that we do this with others. I'm saying we do this with ourselves first. We learn how to frame. We learn maybe my idea is not the best thing. And we set aside our egos and we say, maybe I'm the source. Oftentimes you're not. Oftentimes you're not. It's the behavior of others. And actually framing it not as people are wrong, but perceptions are wrong. And all of a sudden you're sidestepping that risk of turning conflict into a true protracted issue where you have us versus them. Perceptions are not people. Perceptions are inventions of the mind, and they can be easily changed. And again, a good leader can actually weave this. Again, I've been accused of being a spin doctor. I'm not a spin doctor. What I'm doing is providing an effective tool that allows us to see more of the truth, more openness that we can see in order to make a better decision.
All of that, and you just reminded me of something else. And again, bearing in on this exact example where the perceptions are different. I still remember one of my very first, and this, I think I remember this because it kind of hurts still, but I remember spending time with my client, one of these fast-paced, move things along, getting an understanding of their requirements, building it into the external definition of the project, showing them the screen representations as we go along. I remember specifically the day that I had all of my subject matter experts gathered around me, and we brought up the screen in a original sort of pilot fashion before we began to user acceptance test this particular sequence of screens. And I started walking through the screens. There's myself and there's 10 or 12 people behind me. And to a person, they go, that's not what we were expecting. And I'm thinking, no, I've walked through every single page of this in the external design documents. You and I have agreed on this. We've seen this on paper. Now here it is in reality. But that's not what we're expecting. And so what I understood at that moment, that had I stopped for a little while and truly understood what they were, not just the technical drawings of the screens, but the usability of those screens as they went along, we would have ended up with a much different design instead of getting to this point in the project and realizing that there's been not a mistake, the system still worked, but from their perspective, it wasn't as usable as they had expected.
Yes.
It all came down to a difference in perceptions and me as a young Turk project manager not paying attention as well as I should have to what they wanted.
Boy, what a great lesson. This is powerful. This happens more often than not. We don't engage our prefrontal cortex. We don't actually move it in front and actually slow down and think things through. We don't take a read of the room. We don't take a read of our stakeholders or team. And we just go through because this is the way things are. And I have to move fast because change is fast. I have to trust on my experts, but they're not here. And I don't want to bother them because they're busy doing important expert stuff. And I have to trust that they're doing really great stuff. And so we get caught up in this where we have to feel that we have this sense of urgency. And maybe, like you said, maybe we're creating that urgency based on our behaviors.
Yes, and I mean, as I matured and as I got more experience, that never happened again. But it was truly, as you mentioned, it was a lesson that I had to learn. But let me ask you this. Have you ever been, or are you part of, well, I guess we're both kind of these remote kind of workers at this point, but have you ever been part of a culture where conflict was approached in unpreferred manner or a less than ideal manner?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Now, let's define that, because in multiple cultures, conflict needs to be resolved in the way that everybody agrees it. And that may be that we don't discuss it. We don't discuss it over dinner because it'll hurt our digestion. We don't discuss it when we're relaxing because that interrupts something that's more important. And conflict is inconsequential of the relationship, which is a beautiful mindset. We in the West here, especially in the United States, say, let's bring it up, let's be frank, let's be objective, and let's attack it. Now, when you say not preferred, let's go back to what you said. We need to agree on what that means. Unpreferred, right? Basically, in our world, managing or not managing conflict or doing it in a less than preferred manner means it gets in the way of the work at hand. It becomes more important than the progress in our projects. That is the metric that I think that you and I actually follow. Now, again, this is where morals and ethics come in. You have your job supporting the objective, but you have these value systems that you have to hold high also. And so as a leader and a project manager, you have to maintain, this is what we're doing, and this conflict must be managed in this way. So it's very difficult sometimes in some work environments. I've been in work environments where you don't talk about argument because we're happy. And if we're not happy, we're not going to be happy in front of our clients. And it's very, very difficult to actually raise issues and discuss things like conflict and argument.
No, I can definitely see that. And I have worked with cultures where um, I've worked in situations where, for example, when I've asked something of one of the folks on my team, the response I get was, of course, because, and as I found out later on, their response was always positive because they never wanted to disappoint.
Yeah,
Now,
and that's perfect. And that's what they want to do, because they don't want to be perceived as seeing that they personally are holding up the work.
right.
They want to actually understand that, probably there is somebody smarter than me, and I'd rather have them make the decisions so we can make better decisions. And so throwing them into a very complex, here's how we manage conflict discussion is very confusing.
It
And
is.
a lot of times they're not ready for it.
Well, and their culture may not even have prepared them for it as well. I was talking to a colleague of mine from the National Speakers Association who did a project in the East, and I say in the East, in the Eastern culture, as opposed to here. And she was doing a post-mortem on one of this organization's major projects. And as she was walking through, it came down to the vendor, people like you and I, people who managed their IT project. And she asked the question very directly to the CEO and said, well, how did they do? And his answer was, they did fantastic. They came in on time, on budget. They met our exact requirements. And then he added this, and we'll never work with them again. And it's interesting that that vendor had done such a superb job. Again, I go back to that technically part of it, to the technical part of it, but the conflict that they had created on the project, the walking over the subject matter experts, the clients, end users, the treating of them as less than, as opposed to peers in solving the project problems, caused them to say, we will, yes, they brought the project in on time, but we will never work with them again. So again, conflict in that case cost them probably millions of add-on work in a situation like that. But what can you do? You have to be able to, as project leadership, as project executive, understand when you're part of the problem as well.
And that's the problem. Conflict is not like an issue. An issue is something that is quantifiable and measurable, and you can actually work with it really well. And when you get in issues, but when you get into conflict, we're talking about what? We're talking about culture, and we're talking about politics. And that's more systemic. That's more the nature of how people work together and define themselves as a group. Now, traditionally, it's the leader's job to define and ensure that culture and politics are healthy and don't get in the way of the progress of the group. This is where I think we have a lot of room to grow, both in the East and the West. And this is why, one of the reasons why this whole leadership education movement is seen, not just in project management, not just in business, but in everything. There's, so many people are on YouTube, and so many university courses are teaching this stuff, because there seems to be a gap right now.
Well, there's a gap, and let me offer this. Everyone who's listening to us has noticed the deep divides that have been created culturally in this country, in Europe, all over the place, whether it's along racial lines or political lines or whatever it is. There are deep divides, and sometimes those spill over into the workplace and onto projects. And so we as project managers have to be even more aware that we don't allow those sorts of deep divides that are dividing us as peoples not to be brought into the project in such a way that they can disrupt the project in a very negative way. And it becomes, again, part of the educational process, part of our awareness process, part of our tweaking our emotional intelligence so that we are much more on top of these and try to maintain that harmonious environment at all times. Not to say that conflict won't happen, because it will, but have it happen in a healthy way such that we can continue on making progress in our projects and having that healthy environment.
Oh, okay. You're right. You're right. Now, there's a good way to manage conflict, and we can talk about that sometime later. Is there any benefit to conflict, or have you ever observed any benefit to conflict?
I think I have. Yes, and I'll say yes, I have. First of all, let's get this part out of the way. Is that we cannot eliminate tension or conflict in the workplace. We can't eradicate it. It's just not feasible, and in fact, it may not even be healthy.
Right. It's human nature. It's part of being humans. You accept humans, you accept conflict.
Yeah, and if I can go back to that quote I had from Nate Revere, if conflict truly is the energy that is created by the gap in what we want and what we're experiencing, then I think part of what's healthy and what I've experienced is being able to refocus that energy into productive means. And what that can happen is that conflict, as we work out our differences and truly understand what it is that we're doing, it's interesting how we can suddenly spark an innovative idea.
Yeah.
How we can create trust and engagement and cooperation amongst people that previously were conflicted, and how we can actually use that to increase productivity. So yes, I have seen this, but it took deliberate action on my part or my project lead's part to make it happen.
Yes. There has to be proper framing. There has to be boundaries and discipline. There has to be, if we're going to be as a group, we're going to argue, debate, and manage conflict within a set of rules. We don't play outside of those rules. So there has to be some type of boundaries and discipline, and there has to be training, and there has to be mentoring. With those three things in place, you can have a positive outcome. Now, here's the bottom line. I'm going to synthesize what you said. When you have conflict, you have two different ideas, which is better than one idea. Mm-hmm. So the intent is to keep those ideas over here, manage the conflict over here, and then you can get back to work. And you can use your analysis, you can use the strength of your team, and you can even use the energy, because people in conflict are passionate. They're protecting something. They are engaged, and you don't want disengagement. You don't want people who are not passionate. You don't want people to clock in and do their work and go home. You want people who are willing to stand up for what they see, but you also want them to understand that they're part of a group and they play within rules, even you, and that there's ongoing work that we can all use to grow in managing conflict. And this goes for all the interpersonal skills and tools.
Well, and do you remember when I said that part of the conflict that often results in projects is because of an organizational mismanagement, i.e. it goes to the top? So one of the rules, I think you mentioned the process of playing by the rules, of having conflict, having rules, resolving conflict using rules. One of the rules is clarifying everyone's role in the project. Because once you have fuzzy role definition and people are tripping over each other's responsibility, you've already broken your own rules. You have created a set of rules that don't make sense that people try to rely on and create their own conflict. So it comes back often to us as project managers to do this correctly and to do it well.
Yeah. Oh, people who don't know what they're supposed to be doing on a project, number one, are very detrimental to the project. Number two, It's totally the accountability and responsibility of the project manager. If anything is within your power, it's to actually define and remind people and refocus people. Here's what we're doing together. Here's how your work cannot not be done. You are so important. We need this to get done. We value you. And this is, if you do that consistently, people will not spend time trying to protect themselves. Their value system is no longer from what they perceive, it's what they do. It's their actions and their work. Isn't that that's almost poetry.
It is, and I'm going to throw something else at you that I've seen, actually I've participated in, is that we worked on a project. We worked so hard at a collaborative environment, which you want on a project. You want collaboration, but we did it so well that we squashed the contrarians. And it's the contrarians that had some of the ideas that could have kept us out of certain problematic areas.
Yes. This was back in 2006, 2007. I was doing a lot of work in PC fleet management. How do you manage 10,000, 40,000, 50,000 workstations inside of a company, right? And we were looking at automation and security implications of automation. And we had one guy, and whenever he spoke up, everybody groaned. Here he goes again. He's going to slow down the conversation. And all of a sudden, I tweaked on. It was I actually had a conversation leaving the conference room. I said, "You had a good idea." And he said, "Finally, Tim, I don't want to be the person who's against the team. I don't. All I want to do is put an idea on the table, and everybody's focusing on making me the bad guy. I'm not the bad guy. I'm saying I see a risk here." And so it was my perception that was creating that conflict. At that point, I dedicated myself to actually say, let's go ahead and focus this person instead of this become the canary in the cave, basically be that early warning system. And it changed my way of approaching things.
It might have also helped to teach him or work with him in a way of making his message be understood better, as opposed to just from a contrarian point of view. But
exactly.
So in the few minutes that we have left, I'd like to explore in terms of how we approach conflict, or perhaps how we should approach conflict. I have been fortunate in that most of we've had conflict, but most of my projects have been pretty conflict free as far as serious conflict. And so I haven't had a lot of experience in dealing with large amounts of serious conflict. But let's spend a few minutes in terms of how can we, or how have we, perhaps in our experience, approach conflict such that we can turn the negative into something that's more productive.
So, yes, there are traditional ways, right? You can smooth, you can delay, you can play, meet in the middle. You can use an authoritarian, or you can use collaboration, right? And those are the traditional ways to do it.
Yeah.
You can actually build those in and say, okay, guys, I heard you over here and I see what's going on. Now, I know this is not a bad argument, and that's fine, but let's try these out and see which one is the appropriate one. You got to be careful with this, because a lot of times people see arguments as very personal and they don't want you to step in. So you have to be very, very emotionally aware of when it's the right time for you to step into other people's arguments and when not. This is one way that we as leaders, we have to provide an environment that provides them tools and awareness that there's opportunities to practice this, and they can do it safely. And that's one of the major tenets. If you want something to happen, inside your work. Number one, you have to demonstrate it because people are not going to do what you don't do. Number two, you have to make it safe so they can try it out. And if they make mistakes, they can do it over and over and over. And this is a struggle because, we have this sense of time that's critical and everything's urgent, urgent, urgent. And how do you build time into doing this? This is what I struggle with all the time.
Well, and that last part is so important. And I think also the thing that I've learned and I've watched some very experienced project managers deal with this. But what they do is they address it. They don't avoid it. And they address it promptly and they address it equitably. It's interesting how sometimes we can create conflict ourselves or further conflict if it's perceived, again, that word perception, if it's perceived that the resolution is not equitable. Go ahead.
Right. And we do this under contract, right?
Yes.
We do this under contract. When you have a contract, you have these terms and conditions that say we're going to argue. It's natural for humans to argue, so that this is so important that we're putting it in the contract that we're going to agree. We're going to resolve these arguments or dispute resolution. And it goes through a very painful laundry list, right? What if we did that with every relationship? We have this concept in social philosophy, sociology, as well as general philosophy called a social contract. What if we went into every relationship where we said, we're going to argue? It's natural for us. How are we going to do this in such a way that it makes the work stronger, it makes our relationship stronger, and we can be more satisfied coming out of it?
Well, and you argue, if you do argue, you argue the issues. You don't argue the personalities. So you
Right.
separate the idea from the person, because I can disagree with you over something, and yet we can remain relationally strong, even though our ideas don't necessarily correspond.
And that's
So,
and that's what I started off with this talk today with, the bozo bit. The
yes.
bozo bit says that person is a bozo. I flipped them, and all of a sudden, the person is a problem. And this is one of my great life efforts, to attempt every time I'm reaching up to that bozo bit, say, that probably is not the best thing I can do here.
Yeah.
Let's do something different and try something different that creates a we that can get a better result.
Well, and part of that too is creating that. We talked about this a few podcasts ago. We talked about creating the harmonious environment. And the harmonious environment doesn't mean it's conflict free. It just means that we're all working together, striving for the common goal. I remember very specifically one time I had a brand new team lead, my deputy, coming on board on a project that was going along, and then we needed some extra resources. So I was bringing someone who would be acting as my deputy. And what I was aware of is that culturally, he and most of the staff on the team that were working came from two different cultures that were antagonistic to each other in their natural environments. And so one thing I did, because he was a senior person, he was going to be my deputy, I took him aside and I said, okay, we're not going to talk about this, and this. Is that okay with you? And he said, perfectly fine. And having set those criteria beforehand, not even having to talk to the team, he immediately fit in such a way that if there was any cultural differences, you could not see it in the project, to the point that our staff invited us to their homes for dinner and cooked us home cooked meals. So, sometimes you can set those things up front and establish that harmonious environment so that you can, in this case, healthily avoid conflict that should not have ever happened.
Right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So planning, establishing that culture and supporting that healthy culture is some of the most important thing we can do in order to create an environment that has good people doing great work.
And I think as we kind of wrap this up, I think the other thing that I would say to anybody listening to us, whether you're a seasoned project manager or a new person starting out in your first project lead role, is don't be afraid to ask for help. You're not, the be all and end all of every conflict resolution. So don't be afraid to ask.
And mentors. Yeah, that's a great message. Boy, thank you for this. This is exciting. And yes, there are many other topics we can talk in this area. And this is just one toe into the water of managing argument through debate and persuasion and working with human factors that get in the way of the project.
And we handled the whole hour, Tim, without any conflict between ourselves.
So, if anybody listening can actually ask questions of you, where can they find you on the internet?
Probably the best place to ask questions and to get responses is on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn every day. Often stalking some of my heroes in project management, but very much so. LinkedIn, Merv, Jersak, or People First Project Management on LinkedIn. So
excellent. And I as well am over on LinkedIn. There's opportunities me in the future to work in other social media, but for right now, that seems to be my home base. Brilliant. I want to thank you for this great conversation. And for anybody listening to this, whether it's live or recorded, thank you for your participation. If you have more questions, bring them on. We're here to not just discuss this, but actually do it in a way that we can all learn.
And I thank you as well, Tim. Every time I'm on with you, I learn something. I've never approached project management from the ethical perspective. Not that I'm not ethical, because I am, but from actually having studied it from an ethical perspective. So every time you bring something like that up, I learn something new, even in my after 40 years of managing projects.
Well, that's the brilliant thing with our different backgrounds and contexts and perspective. If we have a goal of learning like that, it's going to benefit us both, and we know that. That's great.
All right.
Thanks again.
All right. So next time, see you again next week, exactly the same time, and we will have another interesting topic to debate and discuss on this channel.
Thanks again, Merv. Thanks, everyone.
Until then.